We're beginning chapter 18, A Bastard Nazi, a Flaming Gay Man, and Jackson Stevens. An investigation into the terrorist conspiracies, movements, and activities led to an inquiry into the backgrounds of the people with whom Atta did business. So far, we'd focused almost exclusively on Rudy Deckers, the man who assigned the bunks when they arrived in Venice. As we've seen, Deckers, a Dutch national, was a fugitive from justice in his native Holland. After fleeing in Florida, he became the subject of a multi-agency federal law enforcement task force during the mid-90s, which investigated him for smuggling restricted high technology out of the U.S. Unless smuggling high technology was just a crazy idea Rudy dreamed up one day, unlikely, Deckers probably had so far unrecognized ties to international organized crime. And after he ran a flight school in Venice, Florida, with the distinction of having trained for some far in excess of normal, both the pilots crashing airplanes into the World Trade Center. At a time when Rudy Deckers couldn't buy gas for cash at the Naples airport, he had fronted for the purchase of Huffman Aviation in Venice. By early 2001, it was now his rent at the Venice airport that Rudy couldn't pay. Then, while Mohomed Atta was still in residence in Venice, Rudy launched an airline. His airline partner was active at the moment in concert with the mob in the massive looting of union pension funds controlled by an investment firm in Portland, Capital Consultants. Somehow, no one mentioned any of these connections to Larry King, or Dan Rather, or Bill O'Reilly, or Jane Clayson, or Greta Van Susteren before they put Rudy Deckers on the air, where he was instrumental in creating the official story of Atta's time in Florida. None of these fine journalists, working for esteemed major media organizations, had seen fit to do the tiniest bit of due diligence on a man who had been the terrorist ringleader's first major contact in America. Contact which he continued, as we'll soon see, until less than 2 weeks before the attack. Although Deckers testified it ended in December of the previous year, we slipped down a rabbit hole, and we were mortally offended on behalf of the entire American nation at a government that was manifestly lying to us about important matters concerning 3,000 deaths. We were examining the possibility that both men belonged to a shadowy global network which aided the terrorists while they were in this country. So Deckard's and Hillard's connection with Rick Bolick was of immediate interest. Bolick was going bankrupt at the exact same time as professional aviation in Charlotte County. While Atta was there, taking innocent people's dreams along with their money, some of them later wrote about it. The office is a ghost town, and my phone calls are not being returned, wrote one disgusted student in a discussion among bilked students over how to get their money back. Unfortunately, these people got my block time money and ran away. Crossings Aviation took my money also and ran. Does anyone know of a class action suit being filed? If so, please contact me, wrote another. Rick Bolick was bilking his flight students in Oak Harbor, Washington, at the same time David Byers was slipping away with his students' money in Charlotte County, Florida. At the same time, Rudy Deckers couldn't or wouldn't pay his rent at Venice Airport. The three supposedly unrelated flight schools were all on the ropes during the spring of 2001. Bolick's Crossings Aviation and David Byers' Professional Aviation at the Charlotte County Airport went under. Huffman Aviation wasn't bankrupt, but they couldn't pay the rent. Maybe they couldn't let Huffman go bankrupt because the school was still training terrorists to fly, and would be right up until the days before the attack. Like the other two schools, Bolick's flight training school, Crossings Aviation, received a visit from the FBI, we learned. Investigators were looking into the background of a Federal Aviation Administration electrical engineer who took flight classes with Bolick in 2000, reported local papers. Modele Lawai denied any wrongdoing, but said he'd been interviewed by the Secret Service. Are these similarities just coincidence? If not, we've located the global network British Prime Minister Blair spoke about. But what was the name of the enterprise we had stumbled on? Who had Rudy Deckers and company been working for? We didn't know anyone you could just walk up to and ask. We maybe got a clue from Mike Pickett, the aviation executive who had watched Rick Bolick with the same amazement with which aviation professionals in Florida watched Deckers. When Bolick came in, he was just a restaurant at the Gig Harbor. When Bolick came in, he was just a restaurateur at the Gig Harbor Airport, he said. Then he became the general manager for a German named Volker, a German industrialist buying up all the land in that area. More Germans. Jessica Dealey, an attractive airline professional in her late 20s, worked for Rick Bolick at Harbor Air and later transferred and worked for Rudy Deckers at Florida Air. While Harbor Air was going under, Bolick told Jessica to fly down to Florida and see Rudy. When I walked into Rudy's office, he was yelling and screaming at people, she recalled. He said, people call me a bastard Nazi because I'm loud and I'm German, and I'm very demanding. Deckers told her he was German, not Dutch, Jessica said. When I flew down to Florida from Portland during the first week of March 2001, Rudy didn't even want me to go back, she told us. He said, sit down, he said. I want you to work for me. Make it feasible. What would it take to get you here? Despite having reservations, she was immediately and enthusiastically hired by Deckers to work at Florida Air Station in Tallahassee. He offered me $2,000 to stay and said he'd have people move my things down from Portland. He was in such a hurry for me to come work for him that he burst into a pilot's meeting and had someone fly me round trip up to Tampa and change my ticket. Jessica soon was sorry she'd come. Conditions were chaotic. Employees began comparing notes. All we knew was that Rick and Rudy had worked out some kind of sleaze deal, said Jessica. Rudy had written a check for $500,000 and Rick was keeping it, no matter what. They were screwing each other so bad it was almost comical. Rudy came in with a lot of money, but he didn't know the first thing about running an airline. And Rick was a pilot, and he knew nothing about it either. At the time he owned the Oak Harbor, Washington Airport FBO, it was weird. What I could never understand was Rick was in so much debt it wasn't funny, yet he still flew up to Sun Valley, Idaho in the Albatross almost every weekend, she said. He didn't seem to care. Bolick was never shy about exhibiting his ostentatious lifestyle, said Jessica. You have to understand, Rick is a flaming gay man who, even though he was in desperate financial trouble, was having all the upholstery torn out of one of his planes because he didn't like the color. Both Deckers and Bolick were devotees of the high life, what the kids call living large. It was the need for cash that brought Florida Air and Harbor Air together, and it was the lack of it that caused both to flounder in the months that led up to the terrorist attacks, reported the Tacoma News Tribune in a story on twin failed airlines. But former employees of Harbor Air said Bolick mismanaged the company long before the deal with Florida Air. Keith Chavatal of Gig Harbor said Bolick promised Deckers the farm, but had already slaughtered the cows and shut the doors on the barn. He and one other former employee who spoke privately said extravagant parties and spending presided financial troubles at Harbor Air, said the paper. Chavatal said he owed $400 by Harbor Air. He also wants his former boss to be made accountable for the losses. It's time for Bolick to tell everyone where all of the money went. If people like Bolick ever tell people where all the money went, we've missed it. The business had been there for 30 years, and he had to run it into the ground in less than 3, said Jessica. I remember taking a foreclosure notice on the FBO that came in the mail over to him one day, and when I handed it to him, all he was concerned about was whether the wine cellar on his yacht was stocked for his next weekend excursion. Rick owned a huge hangar at the Gig Harbor, Washington airport where he would keep his toys, she continued. We called the hangar the Toy Box. He had 2 yachts in the hangar, the Grumman Albatross seaplane that he used a lot, a Little Learjet, and a couple of tail draggers. Tail draggers, she explained, were the old-style antique airplanes. Bolick collected them. Things began disappearing from the toy box one by one, said Jessica. First a Cessna, then a Lear. Things kept getting worse. Everything Rick touches that has to do with money ends up disappearing. This we are able to verify for ourselves. Bolick became wealthy when, in 1996, he sold his retirement home business to Altera and cashed out. Then the rest of his business went under. And then Altera tanked too. Someone that followed the stock told us. Even Bolick's Altera Healthcare went sideways. The stock went down 3 years ago from $38 to 22 cents. Somebody lost $37.78 a share. We're sure it wasn't Bolick. Finally, just as they were about to be repoed, they sent the rest of the airplanes down to Florida, said Jessica. And then Rudy found out that Rick had let the insurance on the planes lapse. They were flying uninsured. When Florida Air folded several months later, I'd seen a lot of things I didn't like, she told us, and I wasn't going to do anything illegal for them. Doug Hillebrandt, the then president, called me and wanted me to get a U-Haul and go out to Tallahassee Airport after it closed and get out all of the company's computers and security badges and stuff. But I didn't want to be involved. They sent out some guy in a Suburban. When he tried to snag the airport security badges, I got suspicious and had one of my employees go tell the airport manager what was going on. The airline was out of business, so why would he need the airport security badges? The airport manager came over in a hurry with security. He said, "Oh no, this airline owes the city a lot of money," and the guy in the Suburban just took off. Florida Air's attitude toward airline safety was as brazenly casual as the ad hoc raid on the shutdown Tallahassee airline counter would indicate. In retrospect, some of this is more than appalling. It's chilling, to borrow Rick Bolick's phrase, to consider that Mohomed Atta continued to be active at Venice Airport and was around the operation. Jessica was getting her first tour of Venice, he said, when they passed a room where a security training class was underway for a room full of Florida Air pilots. The class is required before airline personnel are issued the security badges. They must have to pass through airport security, she explained. The guy teaching the class didn't have the CETA badge. That said, he was qualified to teach the course, and he wasn't. I had a CETA badge from Seattle, so I ended up teaching and certifying the class for the course, she said. What I remembered about the 30 or so pilots was that so many of them were foreign. That was very unusual. I'd never seen that many foreign pilots in the same room. There was several French guys, a Russian guy, several Brits. It's incredibly difficult for a French pilot to get a work visa to fly for the airlines in the U.S. When I asked about it, what they told me was that restrictions were looser in Florida. 2 years later, Jessica Deely is still paying for her stint with Rick Bolick and Rudy Deckers. Just a few months back, I heard from a hospital I'd gone to after a horseback riding accident in 1999, she said. They wanted me to pay the insurance portion of my bill. That's when I found out that they had been taking money out of my paycheck for medical coverage, but then not buying the coverage. Isn't that amazing? What did it mean that Rick Bolick operated his aviation business with as little regard for employees and the law as Rudy Deckers did? Bolick's Harbor heirs and... I just keep adding words. Bolick Harbor Air's sudden halt to operations left customers without connecting flights, employees without paychecks, and creditors without payment. Dozens of lawsuits and liens were filed. Deckers had an interestingly and fairly extreme managerial style, said John Villada, a jet manager in Naples. He got in a minor dispute with a mechanic over something, and Rudy was interested in going out and burning this guy's house down. He was serious. I couldn't believe it. Like Bolick, Deckers thought nothing of sniffing someone leaving his employ by stopping Like Bolick, Deckers thought nothing of stiffing someone, leaving his employees by stopping payment of their payroll check. His Florida Air ran aground when pilots refused to fly because they hadn't been paid. A harbor air pilot who had gone to Florida for the airline said the company not only issued him bad checks for his pay, but also failed to pay him the living expenses it had promised, reported the Tacoma News-Tribune on May 26, 2001. Seeking comment from Bolick, the paper came up with an unintentionally funny line which perfectly describes the attitudes of men who routinely get away, for whatever reason, with breaking the law. A house sitter at the Gig Harbor home of Harbor Air, President Rick Bolick said. Bolick was in Europe. Rudy acted like he had diplomatic immunity, the managing editor of the Venice Gondolier had told us. Perhaps he did, because in another freak coincidence, some impressively well-connected people are involved from both sides of the political aisles. Capital Consultants, later taken over by mobsters, had been founded by Charles J. Butch Swindells, an Oregon financier and philanthropist who helped raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to elect President George W. Bush. In April 2001, Swindells was said by the Portland Oregonian to be waiting in line to become the next U.S. ambassador to New Zealand. he wouldn't have to work an extra decade before retiring. And the laborers' union, whose pension fund money was still supporting Rick Bolick in the style to which he had become accustomed long after his business went bust, was led by Arthur Koya, a man who curried and got Bill Clinton's attention and was often invited to official White House events and personal dinners with the Clintons. Koya and his union were longtime big players in the chase for campaign money. The union's various political committees contributed more than 2.6 million in regulated and unregulated so-called soft money donations in the 1996 election cycle. When Koya was indicted under the RICO Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, he told his compatriots, "I talked to Bill Clinton, don't worry." And indeed, the complaint had been squashed. Koya was only tripped up by the same ostentatious style which made John Gotti so eminently expendable. Arthur Koya's love for Ferraris, including one that cost more than $1 million, proved his undoing, reported January 28, 2001 New York Times. Until recently, the president of the National Laborers Union, representing workers at the bottom of the construction pecking order, Koya has agreed to plead guilty to fraud charges for failing to pay about $100,000 in taxes on the purchase of not just one Ferrari, but three. In a spasm of truthfulness, the Times said, "There could be any number of other questions it might be interesting to ask for a Ferrari collecting union official, but not in this country." The chief and, indeed, only accomplishment of Bolick and Decker's unsuccessful airline was that it provided a rationale for the presence on the tarmac of the Venice airport of a half-dozen British aerospace jet streams poised within easy reach of the Caribbean hotspots. Well, the airline did have one other accomplishment. It was publicly endorsed by the then Florida Secretary of State, Kathleen Harris. As one of Florida's top politicians, Catherine Harris doesn't have much time to do a lot of personal traveling, reported the April 16, 2001 Florida Times in Jacksonville. But twice in this past month or so, the Secretary of State, who received national attention for her role in the November presidential election, has taken the 75-minute plane ride from her current home in Tallahassee to her old stomping grounds in Sarasota. Her choice of airline, Florida Air, a startup commuter airline based here, grasping to be an air taxi for the entire state. She has taken the airline twice, Harris spokesman Ben McKay said. She appreciates the convenience that Florida Air offers. When we discovered this, it seemed innocuous. But then we thought, does Kathleen Harris seem the kind of gal who goes around endorsing businesses run by guys who can't pay their rent? Sometimes when things don't make business sense, ex-Florida Air exec Bill Bursch told us, it's because they do make sense, just in some other way. Even in newspaper profiles of Decker's new airline, in its hopeful pre-launch phase, aviation executives said they found it to be a highly dubious enterprise. Other startup commuter airlines have run into problems in the past trying to serve Florida, including Air South and Air Florida, the paper reported. Quite a few airlines have tried to make money serving an intra-Florida market, said Bill Petit, head of marketing at Jacksonville International Airport, but they have all found it to be very difficult. How did Rick Bolick and Rudy Deckers know each other? Who brought them together? Deckers claimed he met Bolick through a mutual friend in Ohio. He's lying. Portland reporter Eric Mason explained Richard Bolick started in a business creating freestanding retirement homes, and he at one point had the largest company, the largest holding of these freestanding retirement homes in the country. One of the retirement homes that belongs to the company that Richard Bolick once held was just a stone's throw from the airport where Mohomed Atta trained. You have to ask yourself, there's a lot of coincidence here. Wait a minute. You have to ask yourself, there's a lot of coincidences here. Are they just coincidences, or is there something more to it? The official story provides an answer. They are just coincidences, or are they freak coincidences? But just a few hundred feet down the block from Huffman Aviation in Venice, Bolick's company, Altera, built a gleaming new assisted living facility during the 1990s. Surely there couldn't be any connection between the assisted living industry and covert operations, could there? There could. We need to look no further than a roundup of the usual suspects. A block away from the Venice airport, on the opposite side of the street from Bolick's assisted living home facility, is a large and stately colonial building which looks eerily like a plush digs of the law firm in the Tom Cruise movie The Firm. The elegant building certainly seems out of place alongside the weed-strewn airport perimeter. It was built, we learned, to house the national headquarters of nursing home giant Beverly Enterprises, which was owned at the time they built it by a name almost synonymous with American covert operations. Gleaming like a movie set in Florida sunshine, the opulent three-story red brick building is a monument to the rivers of money which have flowed through the financial empire of Jackson Stevens, whose name has been linked with every major American scandal of the past generation, from BCCI to Contra cocaine through Mena, Arkansas. Today, the stately building still houses Stevens' former law firm, local political powerhouse Boone and Boone, a firm which worked so closely with client Stevens that at least one of his executives was permanently housed there. Some credit at Boone Law Firm with running the town of Venice still. What? Some credit the Boone Law Firm with running the town of Venice still. Okay, that makes sense. I don't think you could safely say that Boone and Boone run everything in town, one local journalist told us, but you could safely say they run almost everything. They exert a strong influence here, including out at the airport, in an ironic twist worthy of the spy fiction of John le Carre. The very thing that made Venice seem to us such an unlikely destination resort for Arab terrorists, its elderly population attracted the home office of a nursing home company controlled by a man whose name is synonymous with American covert operations during the past several decades. The name of Jackson Stevens, though rarely the man himself, made appearances in all the most whispered about scandals and cover-ups in America. He was named in the BCCI criminal bank scandal, figured somehow in the story of the death of Vince Foster, was linked to the stolen Promise software scandal of the Justice Department, as well as the 1996 campaign finance scandal involving allegations of red Chinese money. Most notably, Jackson Stevens was a figure in the huge scandal involving gun running and cocaine smuggling at Mena, Arkansas during the 1980s. That was behind both the Iran-Contra and Whitewater scandals. Where Stevens was to be implicated in another intelligence-related scandal, it would be, for him, something like 3 or 4 in a row. Stevens' colorful curriculum vitae also included having been the college roommate of President Jimmy Carter at the U.S. Naval Academy. Interestingly enough, the U.S. intelligence agency to which Jackson Stevens' name has been persistently linked, the National Security Agency, was accused by furious government intelligence officials with destroying data pertinent to the September 11th probe, meaning that possible leads stemming from the September 11th attack weren't being followed because of the NSA action, reported the Boston Globe. The founder of Stevens' law firm in Venice, Dan Boone, we discovered, was no slouch in the college roommate department. Back when both were Florida Gators, his roommate had been former Florida Governor Lawton Chiles. Lawton Chiles, I'm going with. Bringing things full circle, Lawton Chiles, although a Democrat, had given Republican Katherine Harris her start in politics, naming her to the board of the Ringling Art Museum in Sarasota. Small world. Stevens was the chief domestic campaign contributor to both George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton in, of course, different campaigns. At first glance, it might seem curious that former President George Bush would attend an event honoring Jackson T. Stevens, the biggest Democratic power broker in Bill Clinton's home state, read a typical report in the Arkansas press, but Mr. Stevens, a self-made billionaire investment banker and philanthropist, is financing a cause that transcends politics, golf. When not occupied with enough philanthropic activities, Mr. Stevens found time to later be fingered as the old man, as Barry Seal called him, behind the Mena, Arkansas's cocaine smuggling scandal, which dogged Bill Clinton throughout his time in office. The Venice airport also surfaced briefly in the news at this time, during questioning of Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearings. A man with an aviation business at the Venice airport named Joe Duncan was alleged to have run guns in the Contras from the Venice airport. What are the odds you'd stroll down the quiet streets of your retired parents' retirement community, which just happened to have trained a bunch of terrorists, and stumble onto a gated palace stuck out. Oh, I gotta read this whole thing. I just fucked it all up, didn't I? What are the odds you'd stroll down the quiet streets of your retired parents' retired community, which just happened to have. I fucked it up again. The Venice airport also surfaced briefly in the news at this time. During questioning of Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearings, a man with an aviation business at the Venice airport named Joe Duncan was alleged to have run guns to the Contras from the Venice airport. What are the odds you'd stroll down the quiet streets of your retired parents' retirement community, which just so happened to have trained a bunch of terrorists, and stumble onto a gated palace stuck out in the boondocks, looking like an emerald city? I think it is a crying shame that Dan Boone and his crowd can raise obscene sums of money to control the election and make it impossible for a candidate without greater resource to run for city council, read an angry letter to the editor in the November 7th Venice Gondolier. We might as well cancel future elections. Pretty much. Jackson Stevens had been an influential presence for several decades in the tiny town of Venice. The Hamburg's cadres the Hamburg cadre's portal into the U.S. Chances are he still was. And that's it for today. Chapter 19, A Leer Too Far, we'll do tomorrow.